Everyone, tonight I'm going to read chapter 2 of The Iron Man by Ted Hughes in two parts. So this is chapter 2, part 1, The Return of the Iron Man. One evening a farmer's son, a boy called Hogarth, was fishing in a stream that ran down to the sea. It was growing too dark to fish. His hook kept getting caught in weeds and bushes. So we stopped fishing and came up from the stream and stood listening to the owls in the wood further up the valley and to the sea behind him. "Hush," said the sea, and again hush, hush, hush. Suddenly he felt a strange feeling. He felt like he was being watched. He felt afraid. He turned and looked up the steep field to the top of the high cliff. Behind that skyline was the sheer rocky cliff and the sea, and on that skyline, just above the edge of it, in the dusk, were two green lights. What were two green lights doing at the top of the cliff? Then, as Hogarth watched, a huge dark figure climbed up over the cliff top. The two lights rose into the sky. They were the giant figure's eyes, a giant black figure, taller than a house, black and towering in the twilight, with green headlamp eyes. The Iron Man! There he stood on the cliff top, looking inland. Hogarth began to run. He ran and ran, home, home. The Iron Man had come back. So he got home at last, and gasping for breath, he told his dad, an Iron Man, a giant." His father frowned, his mother grew pale, his little sister began to cry. His father took down his double-barrelled gun. He believed his son. He went out, he locked the door, he got in the car, he drove to the next farm. But that farmer laughed. He was a fat red man with a fat red-mouthed laugh. When he stopped laughing, his eyes were red too. "An Iron Man? Nonsense," he said. So Hogarth's father got back in his car. Now it was dark and it had begun to rain. He drove to the next farm. That farmer frowned. He believed. "Tomorrow," he said, "we must see what he is, this Iron Man. His feet will have left tracks in the earth." So Hogarth's father again got back into his car. But as he turned the car in the yard, he saw a strange thing in the headlamps. Half a tractor lay there. Just half. Chopped clean off. The other half missing. He got out of his car, and the other farmer came to look too. The tractor had been bitten off. There were big teeth marks in the steel. No explanation. The two men looked at each other. They were puzzled and afraid. What could have bitten the tractor in two? There in the yard, in the rain, in the night, while they'd been talking inside the house. The farmer ran in and bolted his door. Hogarth's father jumped into his car and drove off into the night and the rain as fast as he could, homeward. The rain poured down. Hogarth's father drove hard. The headlights lit up the road and the bushes. Suddenly, two headlamps in a tall tree top at the roadside ahead. Headlamps in a tree top? How? Hogarth's father slowed, peering up to see what the lights might be up there in the treetop. As he slowed, a giant iron foot came down in the middle of the road. A foot as big as a single bed. And the headlamps came down closer. And a giant hand reached down towards the windshield. The Iron Man! Hogarth's father put on speed. He aimed his car at the foot. Crash! He knocked the foot out of the way. He drove on faster and faster, and behind him on the road a clanging, clattering boom went up, as if an iron skyscraper had collapsed. The Iron Giant, with his foot knocked from under him, had toppled over. And so Hogarth's father got home safely. But next morning all farmers were shouting with anger. Where were their tractors, their earth diggers, their ploughs, their harrows? From every farm in the region, all the steel and iron farm machinery had gone. Where to? Who had stolen it all? There was a clue. Here and there lay half a wheel or half an axle or half a mudguard carved with giant tooth marks where it had been bitten off. How had it been bitten off? Steel, bitten off. What had happened? There was another clue. From farm to farm over the soft soil of the fields went giant footprints, each one the size of a single bed. The farmers in a frightened, silent, amazed crowd followed the footprints, and at every farm the footprints visited, all the metal machinery had disappeared. Finally, the footprints led back up to the top of the cliff, where the little boy had seen the Iron Man appear the night before when he was fishing. The footprints led right to the cliff top, and all the way down the cliff were torn marks on the rocks where a huge iron body had slid down. Below, the tide was in, the grey, empty, moving tide. The Iron Man had gone back into the sea. So, the furious farmers began to shout. The Iron Man had stolen all their machinery. Had he eaten it? Anyway, he'd taken it, it had gone. So what if he came again? What would he take next time? Cows? Houses? People? They would have to do something. They couldn't call in the police or the army because nobody would believe them about this iron monster. They would have to do something for themselves. So what did they do? At the bottom of the hill, below where the Iron Man had come over the high cliff, they dug a deep, enormous hole. A hole wider than a house and as deep as 3 trees, one on top of the other. It was a colossal hole, a stupendous hole, and the sides of it were sheer as walls. They pushed all the earth off to one side. They covered the hole with branches, and the branches they covered with straw, and the straw with soil, so that when they finished, the hole looked like a freshly ploughed field. Now on the side of the hole, opposite the slope up to the top of the cliff, they put an old rusty lorry. That was the bait. Now they reckoned the Iron Man would come over the cliff, out of the sea, and he'd see the lorry, which was painted red, and he'd come down to get it, to chew it up and eat it. But on his way to the lorry, he'd be crossing the hole, and the moment he stepped with his great weight onto that soil held up only with straw and branches, he would crash he would crash through into the hole and would never get out. They'd find him there in the hole. Then they'd bring the few bulldozers and earth movers that he hadn't already eaten, and they'd push the pile of earth in on top of him and bury him forever in the hole. They were certain now they'd get him. Next morning, in the excitement, all the farmers gathered together to go along to examine their trap. They came carefully closer, expecting to see his hands tearing at the edge of the pit. They came carefully closer.